All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really controversial documentary called The Soviet Story. And its argument is, well, it's a bombshell. It claims that Soviet communism and Nazism weren't enemies. Not really. Instead, it argues they were deeply, deeply connected.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the film's big idea about these two symbols. Then we'll dig into the shared ideology it claims they had, their alliance, and even their methods of mass murder. And finally, we'll touch on why the film says one is remembered as a crime and the other isn't.
Right, so the film kicks off by throwing a real wrench into how we usually think about these things.
And here's the first big question it poses. You've got the hammer and sickle on one side, and the swastika on the other. Why is it, the film asks, that the swastika is seen as this symbol of absolute, pure evil, while the hammer and sickle often gets a pass, maybe seen as a joke, or just a symbol for a dream that went wrong? This idea, this double standard, that's the jumping off point for everything else.
And it doesn't waste any time getting into the heavy stuff. It immediately puts Nazi killing methods right next to what the Soviet Union did. We're talking about things like thousands of people shot one by one in the back of the head. The message is clear from the get-go. Both were systems of mass murder, but for some reason, we only really remember one of them that way.
Okay, so from that shocking start, the documentary then takes a step back. It wants to look at the ideas, the philosophical roots of all this terror.
And this is where the argument gets really provocative. The film claims that the idea of wiping out entire groups of people wasn't some kind of corruption of Marxism, it was baked in from the start. It uses this quote, which it attributes to Karl Marx himself, to argue that the intellectual blueprint for a revolutionary Holocaust was there, long before the Nazis ever came to power.
So, to really drive this point home, the source introduces this concept of political genocide. This isn't about race, not primarily. It's about the state-sanctioned extermination of people for political or social reasons. And the film's big claim is that the modern origin of this kind of thinking, it's not with the Nazis, it's with Marx and Engels.
This slide really lays out the film's central comparison, side by side. You have communism on one hand, which it says is based on a false sociology, and Nazism on the other, based on a false biology. But look at the goal. Both, according to the film, were trying to create a new perfect kind of human. One classless, one racially pure. And both were essentially at war with human nature itself to get there.
And then it hits you with this, a quote from Joseph Goebbels, of all people, from way back in 1925. He's saying the difference between his Hitler faith and communism is very slight. The documentary uses this to argue that even the Nazis themselves saw a deep connection, that they saw themselves as a kind of socialist, just a national one instead of an international one.
Now, this is where it gets even wider. The film argues that these ideas weren't just in Germany or Russia. It points to prominent Western intellectuals, like the playwright Bernard Shaw. And this quote it presents is, well, it's chilling. Shaw is supposedly advocating for a humane gas to get rid of social parasites. The documentary presents this as a disturbing sign of the times, a precursor to the very methods the Nazis would later use on an industrial scale.
Okay, so after laying out the ideological groundwork, the film pivots. It moves from ideas to actions, specifically the military alliance between Hitler and Stalin.
And look at this timeline. It tells a very different story about the start of World War II than the one we usually hear. First, you have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August '39. Then, September 1st, Germany invades Poland. But just a couple of weeks later, the Soviet Union invades from the other side. And the whole thing is capped off with a joint Nazi-Soviet military parade. The film frames this not as two enemies, but as partners in crime.
And if you thought that was just politics, just a practical alliance, the film presents this quote from Soviet Premier Molotov. In late 1939, he says, "Fighting Hitler's ideology is not only senseless, but criminal." Criminal. Think about that. The documentary asks, why on earth would you call fighting Hitlerism a crime? And the answer it gives is that, well, the ideologies were just too close for comfort.
This wasn't just them promising not to attack each other. The film details a deep, active partnership. The USSR gave the Nazis a naval base. They supplied them with critical resources, grain, oil, iron ore. They even allegedly used Soviet radio to guide Nazi bombers. And maybe most shockingly, it claims the secret police, the NKVD and the Gestapo, worked together, with the Soviets handing over communists and Jews right into Nazi hands.
All right, so we've seen the alleged ideological connection and the military alliance. Now the film gets into the mechanics, the actual how of mass murder.
7 million. That's the number the film puts on the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine of the early 1930s. And it argues this was absolutely not a natural disaster. It was, according to the documentary, a deliberate, man-made famine, a genocide by starvation, designed to break the will of the Ukrainian people.
And here's the supposed smoking gun. At the exact same time that millions of its own people were starving to death, the Soviet Union was actually increasing its grain exports to the West. The film presents this as undeniable proof that this was a political weapon, a calculated act of mass murder, selling food while its people died.
So the film lays out what it calls the Soviet process, step by step. First, you dehumanize your target. You call them class enemies. You mock them. Then you isolate them, arrest them, ship them off to camps. Step 3 is execution, often a simple shot to the back of the head. And finally, you conceal the evidence. Dump the bodies in mass graves in the middle of nowhere, like at Katyn.
Now, look at the Nazi process as the film presents it. It's almost a carbon copy. Dehumanize your victims, in this case, Jews and others. Isolate them in ghettos and camps. Execute them, just with more industrial methods. And then conceal the bodies. The argument here is that the Nazis didn't invent this process from scratch. They learned from and then improved upon the Soviet model.
And this is where the claims get even more specific and, frankly, shocking. The documentary alleges that the very first modern extermination camps were set up by Lenin. It claims that gas vans, literally trucks designed to kill people with their own exhaust fumes, were a Soviet invention from the 1930s. It even says the NKVD trained Gestapo officers. The core idea is that the Nazis were late to the game, learning from a system of terror that had been running for 20 years already.
Okay, so if all this is true, according to the film, it raises a huge question. Why do we remember these two regimes so differently? And that's the final piece of the puzzle that documentary tries to solve.
The film's answer is actually pretty simple. It all comes down to who won the war. Nazi Germany was defeated. Its leaders were put on trial at Nuremberg. Their crimes were exposed and condemned. But the Soviet Union, they were on the winning side. They were one of the allies. So instead of facing trial, their leaders were celebrated as heroes who defeated fascism. The documentary's point is that it was the outcome of the war, not the crimes themselves, that decided their legacies.
And the film argues that this isn't just ancient history. This legacy of impunity, it says, has consequences right now. It points out that the Soviets actually continue to use Nazi concentration camps after the war. That the people who carried out Soviet massacres got medals, not prison sentences. That KGB veterans are still honored in modern Russia. And it even suggests that Europe's dependence on Russian energy makes it hesitant to fully condemn these past crimes.
And so that's the final lingering question the documentary leaves you with. It's a huge one. What does it mean for us today when one genocide is prosecuted, remembered, and taught to every schoolchild, while another one, which the film argues was just as massive, is largely ignored or forgotten? It challenges you to really think about the history we think we know and ask what happens when justice isn't for everyone.